Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I am Ellen Partridge, the Strategy and Policy Director with the Shared Use Mobility Center. To describe myself for those who are visually impaired, I am a woman with glasses with dark rims. I'm wearing a black shirt. Welcome to the National Shared Use Mobility Summit. Our sessions today are on the subject of financial and funding systems. This particular session is about markets. Specifically, can markets really make mobility more equitable? The market is sometimes regarded as a savior, quickly processing reams of information to allocate goods and services, and with competition encouraging innovation and efficiency. But how do we make markets work for people? We have three distinguished people to talk about this, about whether and how markets really can make mobility more equitable. So our three discussants are Dr. Jason Jackson, Assistant Professor of Political Economy and Urban Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His research is broadly concerned with the relationship between states and markets. Next we have Shilpi Kumar. She's a partner with Urban Us, an investment platform focused on urban tech and climate solutions. And we have Bracey, who is the CEO and co-founder of the TechEquity Collaborative. Her work focuses on the intersection of technology and political and economic inequality. The TechEquity Collaborative is an organization that mobilizes tech workers and companies to advocate for economic equity in communities. And you can read about more about each of these folks in our summit website. So in this conversation, each of our discussants will introduce themselves with a brief visual description and give a couple of points on that initial question of whether markets can make mobility more equitable. And the conversation will grow from there. So let me turn it over to you, Jason.
Great, thanks very much, Ellen. And also thanks more broadly to you and your colleagues for the invitation to participate in this conversation. And I'm really excited to engage with Catherine and Shilpi, so I'm looking forward to a really fun chat over the course of this panel. So I'm Jason Jackson. For those who may be visually impaired, I'm wearing a white shirt, a black hair. And as Ellen said, I teach at MIT and do work sort of broadly thinking about these kinds of questions of markets, what their role is, and in particular, how markets, what the relationship is between markets and society. So with respect to the question that's really on the table around markets and their capacity to deliver equitable outcomes, I would say it really just depends. So markets are first come in many different forms. So oftentimes there's the tendency, I think, that we have to refer to the market as sort of one kind of sort of entity, but markets are quite diverse. So they can look really different and do look really different in different places. And also they look different depending on the kinds of function they're serving. So markets for particular types of goods or services look different in different countries and at different points in time over the history of capitalism over the last couple hundred years. So the first point would be simply to say that markets are diverse. And so that then suggests that the question as to whether or not markets can deliver equitable outcomes really depends on how markets are configured. In the current moment in the United States, I would suggest that in the context of mobility markets, and in particular the sort of explosion of innovation, sort of new business models, new firms, et cetera, that we've seen in the mobility space over the course of the last 10 to 15 years. I mean, the fact that we're referring to this as the mobility space and not transportation or transit, for example, I think speaks to this, suggests that on one hand, there have been really, really big changes, and certainly markets have been central to this. But one of the challenges, I think, in the direction that things have been taking broadly, so this is a very broad brush comment, is that much of the innovation and much of the both technological innovation and sort of business model innovation, which are similar but not necessarily always the same, much of what's taken place thus far has been driven by private profit motives, and institutionally has relied on sort of factors that sort of reinforce this sort of private profit nature. So types of risk capital, venture capital, and other forms of risk capital that are geared towards private gain. Oftentimes the motivations, sort of understandably, of many of the people who enter this space, many of the entrepreneurs, is a sort of profit motive and so forth. And so this perhaps may have skewed the direction that mobility innovations have taken sort of writ large over the course of the last several years. This is not to suggest that this is the only way that they can be, the only direction that they can take, but that seems to be the general trend. Of course, there's pushback on this. So there are lots of really interesting firms, projects, and so forth that are really concerned with public gain, with broader societal benefits that might arise from mobility, that of course see mobility as central to issues of equity and distribution. And so I don't want to suggest that those don't exist. They're very much there and very important, but they're competing within an overarching institutional context in the US in this current moment that's very much geared towards private profit. So I would just suggest that as my sort of initial reaction to the question, that's one of the sort of issues that are perhaps on the table. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, I think I'm next. Again, Catherine Bracey, CEO and founder of the TechEquity Collaborative. I think as Ellen described in the intro, our work is really focused on mobilizing the tech community, and that includes tech workers and tech companies around issues that we think will make the growing tech economy work better for everybody. And that we really focus on housing and workforce and labor issues, and obviously transportation is the issue that connects those two things. So it's kind of on our radar as well. I would say the angle that I look at this question from is more from the perspective of the economic systems that drive the tech sector right now. And to Jason's point about, whether markets can create better opportunities for shared mobility is really dependent on how those markets are configured. I think it's really important for us to look at the underlying economic structure for the modern tech industry when we think about how markets are configured. And I know Shilpi is a venture capitalist and can talk more to this when she introduces herself. But from my point of view, I think that the way venture capital, the expectations that venture capital creates are maximalist, right? So the profit motivations are get as much as you can. The expectation is high returns by and large. And that doesn't, that's just one kind of market. So I think that, when we look at the way that venture-backed companies, private sector companies have played in the transportation space, I don't think it's been great. I don't know that it's really solved a market problem or improved public transportation or transportation and mobility as a public good. But that's not to say that some other form of private sector profit-making industry or company couldn't do that. So I think we need to distinguish between, what is a maximalist venture-backed approach to solving these problems and what the expectations are for investors who are moving into that space versus what another model of private sector capital-driven shared mobility could look like that stands alone from, public transportation, but isn't necessarily looking to maximize every penny out of the system that they can get without really a deep concern for the impacts on the community at large. And I'm happy to talk more about, the ways I think that venture capital are structured that differentiate it from other forms of capital investment or economic structures that fuel private sector industries that make it so, I don't know, dangerous might be a little bit of a loaded term, but not really solving the problems that we need to solve as a public. So I'll stop there and hand it to Shilpi.
Thanks, Catherine. I feel like I got queued up to defend or at least provide a further introduction. So my name's Shilpi. I'm a partner with a fund called Urbanus, and we're an investment platform that uses both venture investments in the form of equity investments as well as structured debt financing to support early stage startups and founders who are building solutions. And we look at the intersection of cities and climate change. So work across mobility, construction, the built environment, energy and grid solutions, as well as government and civic tech. And so a lot of the teams that we work with, we're about 100 companies, portfolio companies deep that we've been investing in over the last 8 years. We see lots of different stages and different types of outcomes on how they're doing. But our sector specific sort of in what we look at, and have primarily been focused on North America and Europe, although we're just starting to think internationally and about the solutions that are required in different markets. And I think the question's a really good one. And I think can markets make mobility more equitable, requirability and unequitable for sure. Just to respond, I think, to the venture capital and sort of maximizing, one way that I think about it is innovation and sort of, I feel like I'm like representing the innovation sector of the economy right now, but the benefits of innovation, right, are that they're at the beginning and kind of in any problem space where we have some either inefficiencies or people being left out of a solution or high cost of emissions for a solution, any places where there's an opportunity for change. There's lots of different things that, like, from many different organizations, from academia, from incumbents, from government, from innovators that could fill the gap of that solution. And that's across many markets, right? So you could look at it, if there's not enough ways to commute across, I live in Oakland, if there's not enough ways to commute in Oakland for lots of different types of people, an equitable solution to that could come from any number of entities. And I think the role of venture capital in the economy and in kind of serving public good is to take some of the riskier capital intensive options and both interrogate and support some of those which could fill the gap. And I think it's a conversation, right, between the communities that those solutions inhabit, between the customers who are choosing to engage in those solutions, which I think, customers make up the market. The market doesn't necessarily have its own autonomy in that way. And, a conversation between regulators, a conversation between manufacturers of those goods, and that all those dimensions of the market define sort of what level of risk a investor can take on something and what survives that. So I think in terms of maximizing, there is definitely a culture of like scale and growth and what could spread. At my firm, we think a lot about dimensions of impact before we make investments, although because we're early investors, we can't necessarily predict and see around corners years and years later. We do look at what greenhouse gas reductions, what is the impact this would have on infrastructure, and what communities could this have unintended consequences for? And that's a part of our lens. I don't think that is like mainstream per se, but that's just one way we think about it, and happy to share more. I think, I'm always seeking advice, and I'm sort of like an interdisciplinary person and learner in this way. But I think, for early companies, what could technology offerings do to look for inclusion and equity at the beginning of their companies? And I think probably both of you have thought about this and in depth more than I have. So I'd love to hear, it's instead of can markets really make mobility, it's say what would it take to have technology have equitable solutions, maybe despite markets. And that's kind of another way to think about the question.
So I'm curious, Shilpi, the thing that you said that struck me was, that venture capital exists to sort of, to take on the risky investments that require a lot of upfront capital. But the companies that have disrupted transportation weren't particularly risky, nor did they require that much capital investment. I'm thinking obviously of Uber and Lyft. And that for me is something that I view as just a problem across sectors, that venture capital now is not the niche investment vehicle that high risk, capital intensive, companies or innovators go to find, the people who are willing to invest in their thing that, is high risk, high reward. It has infused every aspect of our economy, every kind of company, from apparel. I don't know why apparel all of a sudden needs to be venture backed. If you think it's not particularly risky or capital intensive. And it existed well before venture capital was a thing. So I just wonder, as when we look at where venture capital and venture-backed companies should be investing, with more money going into things that aren't particularly risky or capital intensive, how does that affect the analysis? I think also just this expectation that, they still, despite the fact that it's not all that risky, require huge returns in a relatively short period of time. It makes it a lot harder, to answer your question, to really do the things that would be required for equity to be built into the company from the beginning. So I'm thinking like Uber's, and I hate to use them as the only example of a mobility company, but they're the imperative for them to move fast, to go into cities and enter markets without talking to regulators or doing any community engagement first, to really to undercut their competition, to basically subsidize the rides with venture dollars in order to take over the market as quickly as possible and get as big as possible as quickly as they could. Just all of that is so fundamental from a venture mindset that it's fundamentally at odds with any sort of thing you would want to do to actually make sure that equity is embedded in the culture of the company or the sector from the beginning. So I guess I know that venture is very diverse, and I'm not, I don't mean this as sort of an indictment of the way that you make investments, but I just think that if we're looking at venture capital as, the thing we need to make high risk investments that require a lot of upfront capital, I think we need to ask ourselves whether it's really necessary in the mobility space. Now, in the clean tech space, maybe we could have a conversation, because that's like long-term investments that are very capital intensive upfront. We're not sure if they're going to work. So maybe that is a way to do it. But I think we've seen that when the type of venture capital investors who have made a lot of money in software try to invest in clean tech, they don't do very well applying that software playbook to the clean tech industry. So I just wonder really if we need other models for solving these kinds of problems. And Jason, I'd actually be curious to hear what you have to say about this. I'm self-conscious knowing that you are actually an expert on this, and I'm just kind of sitting here observing from the outside.
Yeah, Jason, if you want to add anything, I'm happy to respond to both.
So no, I think that's a super question. I'm really keen to hear your response, Shilpi. So maybe the only thing I would just love to get your thoughts on as well is kind of this point that ties into this point that Catherine just made in her question about venture being diverse. So sort of saying that, Catherine is saying that she recognizes that venture is diverse, but nevertheless, what we see, the big thrust we see, sort of follows along the lines that Catherine laid out. And so I'd love to.
I'm also quite distrustful, I think, of venture capital as an institution. I think the strands of kind of hope we have are from newer players like us who are serving as like an alternative for some of the large allocations that exist in institutional finance have a very small part. We think about it as this like very big, influential kind of like high marketed sector when really it's a really small part of our economy overall that is dedicated to venture capital and these equity investments and small startups. It's growing, but it's not necessarily like the end all be all of what exists. So our limited partners, come from, everything down from universities and pension funds and kind of traditionally so parts of allocations from universities, endowments, as well as private companies and corporations, all the way to family offices and individuals. So I think the decisions that people make are to have this kind of part of their risk portfolio, which if you think about equity in terms of the financial inclusion of that, who gets to have access to these, 10x, 20x returns is like another way to think about equity, right? Where some things that grow fast and solve big real problems. I think the apparel example is a really interesting one. The last, let's call it 100 years have been built on fast fashion and kind of large brands defining what exists in apparel. And as we rethink materials and we rethink recycling and we rethink vintage, one of my favorite companies in our portfolio is a company called Thrilling that's gets vintage stores to allow their inventory to be online and allows for kind of like mass market secondhand and all the independent vintage shop owners to have kind of customers beyond their local market, especially during COVID. It was really valuable. And obviously it's not related to mobility, but like, I do think that redefining what gets to exist in apparel, or one of the companies I work with closely is an electric charging company, a wireless charging company. So building infrastructure in cities incompatible with automobiles as well as buses to be able to sort of change the charging infrastructure that's going to be required as autonomy comes on. It's a company called Resonant Link. There's a lot of things that intersect, right? So we can't be like, okay, venture capital is only for software and only for fintech, or finance and banks, but we can't actually think about the finance that exists within transportation or like the transaction. What if there was no way to have, phone-based transactions happen in between us and our bus systems, or us and, when you take the subway in New York now, like you can use your phone, like all of these technologies can enhance our access to our mobility in other ways, right? And so I think kind of trying to draw those lines can become problematic. I think to answer on, why do we need venture? So to me, the default of what exists is the people who already have power continue to have power. So the cities and nation states and Fortune 100 companies and who kind of already defines what the systems look like. And honestly, the like extractive high emissions industries that our current industrial kind of at least Western civilization side of things or kind of the global North relies on are not sufficient and to me like really need a radical and urgent change. And so are we relying on existing power, and actually like both public and private companies who exist in those large power structures have a lot of like security in the current systems, right? In the current ways that capital and there's lots of other entities like this that are giving grants and other types of funding and SBIR opportunities away, but making space for newcomers and new ideas and being able to champion those and reward what grows. And I think one of the things that venture capital does do well is it provides outweighed access as something is working to continue to find inertia and grow. And that can have really negative consequences. But
what do you mean? Can you say what you mean by outweighed access?
Yeah. So like if a small business is doing really well in Oakland and is able to provide, let's say like shuttle services, right? And it's providing really good shuttle services for the elderly and the young around town, and is providing it's able to do that well. The current system of finance doesn't really allow for that thing to grow beyond its regional capacity, or like to have enough capital to take risks and try to provide other services, or try to expand to a new region. That's a lot of what venture capital does, is it provides that capital to grow once there's something that's proven, once there's a seed of what's proven.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess the question is like, at what scale? So if that company in your example just wants to go to one other city, or, has like a plan for 2 or 3x growth, as opposed to 8 or 10x growth. What I find, and I agree with you that what's driving this is a lack of forms of funding. Because even like I've talked to startup founders who look for debt financing, and even when they go to a bank to get debt financing or a loan, their creditworthiness is in part determined by their ability to raise venture capital. So it is really dangerously infecting our economy in a way that is driving all entrepreneurship into one kind of model that seeks an 8 to 10x return, rather than just like linear growth as opposed to exponential growth. And so in the companies in your example often get pushed to do more than they want to do, or that they should do, because, well, you're coming to me and asking for money to go to one other city, but like, I need you to go to 10 other cities in order for it to be worth my while. And so they shoehorn their business plan into something that's going to meet the expectations of the investors, whether or not it's good for their business. And then they're sort of urgently trying to hit those targets, and often at the expense of the communities where they are working. And I think, I don't know how pervasive that dynamic is in the mobility space, but it is certainly becoming an increasing problem, I think, in the economy overall. And it is driven, to your point, by a lack of other kinds of investment in the middle, right? Like, you either bootstrap or you get venture funding, and everything in between is really hard to come by. I do want to answer one of the questions in the Q&A just real quick. Benji was asking about examples of other kinds of market systems that could work. I mean, government investment funds, I know that sounds socialist, but we used to do that in this country, and it worked. And I think ever since the whole Solyndra debacle, it's probably not as politically feasible as it would have been 10 or 20 years ago. But that's an option. And I bet you that fund that included Solyndra did a lot better than a lot of private venture funds that were working in the clean tech space. So, I mean, I think we should look at that. Another, an example of a transportation system that I think there is a model for, a private or market-based solution. Many large cities around the world have informal transportation systems to augment the public system. And, I don't know that this is a good example from an equity perspective, because it really is just highlighting the ways in which the public system has failed many communities. But you saw actors come in and set up market-based systems to run informal private bus services that now actually kind of dominate in a lot of places in like Nairobi or Mexico City and places like that. So I think we have seen sort of market type solutions come in that aren't necessarily venture backed, that actually work for people and provide access for people.
Yeah, I actually, I mean, I want to just respond to that too. Like in 2010, the DOE invested or put $465 million into Tesla, which is like something we don't hear about or talk about. But
they might have been in the same fund that Solyndra was in.
It sounds like it might have been. And I think that the relationship of government to risk is actually one that we want to mitigate, right? We don't necessarily want, I think that there's like a measured amount of money that can come from our public entities into uncertain outcomes, right? So I think that dynamic we have to figure out if we're okay, authorizing cities to invest in things that we're not sure haven't been proven yet. And so it's like, how do those things get to proven, right? Without some type of relationship. And I'm completely with you on more capital options and kind of diversifying the number of capital required, the types of capital. I think we push a lot of our companies to raise on Republic and open crowdfunding because we think that like diversified ownership can be really good actually over time and change the type of stakeholders and the types of investors that like need to be part of the company, for it to grow. And yeah, a lot of the companies we work with have been propped many times by public funding. And I think Europe is actually way ahead of us in this way, maybe because of the socialist bent, but the US, especially from a climate perspective and climate tech is really learning like what type of resources could augment innovation outside of private capital. And so that choice between, bootstrapping, which isn't an option for many founders and entrepreneurs, right? That's such a privilege to be able to bootstrap. And venture capital, and then revenue-based growth. Like there should be other options. Our fund is actually putting together these structured debt facilities to help companies become bankable earlier in their life cycle, because we can understand the risk on other dimensions. And so even companies who are not ever going to put venture capital into or take equity investments, we're putting together some shorter term, lower interest debt options to help prove bankability. So that they can access, more traditional finance options earlier.
I just wanted to jump in real quick and just to maybe push back a little bit on the, certainly to do two things. So one is to push back a little bit of the sort of idea that government, the way that the government or governments engage in market spaces is socialist. I would actually say that's completely capitalist. In fact, just the examples that have been given just in our conversation here speak precisely to this. If you look, whether it be in the United States, which we tend to think about as on some sort of range of sort of more capitalist than maybe parts of Europe or Asia or Latin America. If you look across many of these kinds of market segments, what we in fact see is the state everywhere. The most obvious ways are in providing, the regulatory framework, but obvious big ways are some of the ones that were just mentioned, which is in providing finance, direct finance, oftentimes, including to firms that, raise eyebrows, just like you guys are mentioning, like Tesla. Like, why does, for Tesla to be getting $500 million from the DOE, seems interesting, right? And so if we look, the point is that if we look across the way markets, not just in mobility spaces, but in others as well, actually work, you see tons of government money that comes through in all sorts of ways. I mean, Shilpi, earlier you mentioned SBR funding, for example, as another sort of example. And then also, earlier in the conversation, it was interesting when we're noting that venture, Shilpi, I think you noted this, that venture is relatively small in terms of the amount of capital. But one of the things that we find, of course, has this kind of outsized impact on the economy. I think that's some of the things that Catherine was noting. But with respect to risk, venture is, I would suggest, is not the institutional source of that sort of supplies capital to the most risky investments. The government is, especially if we start to think about the distinction between risk and uncertainty. So where it just becomes, because of lack of information, it becomes just very difficult to even start to think about, sort of assigning sort of probabilities and so forth to particular outcomes. So the government, both now and historically in the US and certainly in other countries as well, has always played a huge role. I think what we find, what's kind of more interesting is this kind of, I don't know if it's a discomfort or sometimes it's, just a sort of idea that, well, if the government is involved, it must be socialist, but it's not at all. I mean, this is fundamentally, I would say, capitalist. So one other thought that I just wanted to sort of put out, and this is kind of maybe more towards Catherine. So a lot of our discussion so far has been about sort of VC and we're really fortunate to have Shilpi with us to sort of share these insights. But there are other, of course, key actors and stakeholders as well. And certainly one, I think in this issue of equity, are tech workers. And certainly recently, by which I mean the last couple of years, we've seen tech workers as a sort of group become more visible and in many cases more organized around a variety of issues. But the question that I had maybe for Catherine is, to what extent do you see tech workers playing a role in these issues? That is to say, how the decisions around focus on sort of profit versus equity, and how systems are designed, how products are designed, and so forth, ultimately are done by tech workers. And so I was wondering to what extent you saw tech workers having a role in this issue.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge opportunity, put it that way. Let's say untapped potential, and I think we've obviously seen over the last 5 years them wake up to the understanding of their own power, but it hasn't really been strategically organized yet. I think that the high-profile examples have been pretty disjointed and focused on kind of one-off kind of things that crop up and not really with any sort of strong long-term strategic vision. They also tend to be focused inside companies, right? So they're very siloed. And there isn't yet although we are trying to do this, there isn't yet a large sort of cross-sectoral coming together of tech workers. It's a knotty issue. I could geek out with organizers about how this is a challenge, an organizing challenge in many ways. A lot of tech workers don't think of themselves as tech workers, and organizing people around an identity that they don't necessarily hold is difficult. But having said that, we know that when the people who work in the companies and on the products are more conscious of the potential impacts those products could have in communities, they are more likely to avoid those harms. What is required is, diversity. So people who are in these companies who come from a wide range of perspectives and maybe have lived experiences of the potential harms, so they can spot them before they're out in the wild. Time, so that there is time to kind of interrogate what they're building, test it, redesign it if they need to. And those kinds of things, maybe capital, more capital investment in people. Those kinds of things are hard to advocate for in the context of venture-backed companies, that we find that the time frame that they need to get the product out, the sort of the sense of agile development, which has been sort of held up as dogma, is sort of get the product out there and just see how it works before we actually really know anything about it. That kind of culture and mentality and the economic structure that underlies the business model makes it harder for those practices to take root inside a company.
One thing I want to add, I do think that some of the hope I have is in the dollars that are going towards ESG and kind of more thoughtful types of impact through the mechanism of venture capital. There's a lot of conversation going on about this in my sector, both on the LP, the limited partners in venture capital within funds and, within founders and the companies that are being started, not only on how to measure that, but also in terms of what it means for the industry overall. And I wanted to highlight my colleague Liz Sisson. She actually did a fellowship at the Belfer Center at Harvard recently on technology and public purpose, on how venture capital can think more about public purpose and the unintended consequences of their investments. And I can share it in the chat. It's a really well thought out paper and playbook, and she brought in a lot of influence to sort of think through this in an in-depth way. And it was really well received in terms of, who is trying to ask these questions and sort of invest with greater resources. And another way this ends up happening is in board governance, right? So from Series A, or usually the first price round of investment, investors will take board seats, and there's also outside independent board members in addition to founders. And the way that private companies are being judged is reflecting a lot of how public companies are being judged as well, in terms of the value system and what the implications of the technology are. And so I think governance and being able to sort of make decisions outside of profit, because they impact profit, right? And sort of the long-term sustainability and longevity of the company, as well as valuation. And so there is a real response, I think, to the last, even let's call it 10 years of blowups that we've seen in mobility tech companies of, what the implications of these are. So I wouldn't say that it's the most long-minded, most grounded industry, but there is some, small reasons for hope here. I mean, I could ask a question here, and I think this is, kind of coming back to how we think about markets outside of, venture capital. I think there's, all these different sides of it, but, how could we, let's say, we're designing a new type of market. And I saw someone mention Mariana Mazzucato, who I really love as an economist who thinks about value kind of from a fundamental thing. And I think a lot about like the bridge that we need to have towards a new set of industries and a new set of kind of rules for how industries function in relationship to society and to the planet. So, maybe starting with Jason, how do you think markets can be designed to generate both useful innovations and equitable outcomes?
Yeah, no, so I think thinking about the work of people like Mariana Mazzucato, I think is kind of the place to begin. So, so I think first, there are a couple of things. So one is, I think, a kind of cultural and sort of ideational shift. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying before about the role of the state, a recognition of the fundamental role of the state in markets. Not even as a normative thing, but just as a reality. I think Mariana Mazzucato's work speaks precisely to this, just highlighting the ways that the state has been central to innovation in economies in the advanced industrialized world, historically and in the present. So certainly I think that's one. Secondly, I think we need more institutional innovation. And this is really to kind of address some of the issues, Shilpi, that you kind of noted. The sort of extent, and Catherine as well, so the extent to which venture capital is, you have these two options if you're an entrepreneur, right? You can try to go the VC route, you can try to go the bank route, and they're so starkly different in terms of what you need to present to the decision makers on both sides. And that really serves, as you both, I think, have said, to really narrow the kind of strategic sort of directions that firms can take, sort of startups can take. And this is where equity oftentimes gets squeezed out. I think, Shilpi, what your firm is doing, I think, is great, but it's sort of a minority, unfortunately. Within the industry, we need more, we need to figure out how to, replicate you guys and scale you guys rather than, much of the other things. And so, if we could get more institutional innovation, more ways of getting risk capital that is much more attentive towards, or maybe even explicitly focused on issues of.
Hi, sorry, I think we lost Dr. Jackson just when he was making his final point. But I will see if he joins us again. I was just going to jump in because we are at time. But thank you so much to the panelists. This was such a wonderful conversation.